Welcome to the latest VSI webinar. It's been a great series. Top people coming and joining our community to chat around lunchtime. We're delighted today to welcome the father and son double act of Bill Beaumont, chairman of World Rugby, and his Premiership playing son, Josh, who's on the way back after quite a significant knee injury. So we've got them both together today, and in charge of ceremonies as usual is Tom Sears, and we've got Tim, who's at Mission Control back in Didsbury. So can I pass you on to Tom, who is going to put Josh and Bill through their first series of questions.
Thanks, Andy, and afternoon, everybody. Before we continue and we welcome Josh and Bill formally, I'll just put you on to Tim, who'll give you details of how you can contribute to the session and ask some questions via the online platform.
Cheers, Tom. Yeah, thank you. So guys, if you're lucky enough to be a participant on this or an attendee, use the chat box at the bottom. I know you can use a Q&A, it raises the hand and does all the rest of the stuff. If you use the chat box, we can see the questions, and we know then whether, when we come to ask a couple of them at the end, whether they're going to already been asked in Tom's questions, so we can make sure that no one asks the same sort of things. We're not duplicating it. So if you can use the chat box at the bottom, that's spot on. And we'll ask a few questions at the end. Apart from that, Mr. Sears, over to you, sir. This is definitely the hospital pass between two rugby greats.
Thanks, Tim. Appreciate it. Bill and Josh, thanks for joining us and making the time. Appreciate you both exceptionally busy at the moment in different aspects. I think the obvious thing to talk about at the moment will be the current crisis that we're in with the COVID-19, the crisis that sport is facing globally. Can you just both give us an update on what's happening at your respective organisations? Josh at Sale Sharks, Bill at World Rugby.
Yeah, I'll start off. Yeah, so yeah, at Sale we're obviously we're hands for the government guidelines of the week before. We got put into lockdown. The players were spoken to by the owners, and this is when it all came out about the the wage reductions that we've had to take, and so that was all communicated to us. And then as soon as the lockdown was put in place by the government, the players have just been we've just been at home and kind of making the most out of the situation we're given at the moment. And for me, that's as was alluded to before, I had quite a significant knee injury in November, so I was, midway through my rehab process. So I'm just trying my best to, to carry that on at home. We were lucky enough to pick up all the gym equipment from Sale before I went into lockdown, and just carrying on with my rehab process. And then, we're just, club have been in constant dialogue with us, explaining, what's been going on. But at the moment, we've just got to follow the guidelines, and that's all we know at the moment in terms of there's no real date set when we can go back into training. There's things coming out of other clubs in terms of when that's predicted by, but no one really knows at the moment.
And Bill, in terms of World Rugby, what's happening there?
Well, that we made £75 million available to package to help countries, sort of both tier 1 and tier 2 countries, who are in real financial sort of straits at the moment. Because if you think down in the south, that they had to cancel their rugby championship, they don't know if they're going to have any incoming tours, which obviously generate funds for them. In July, it's looking highly doubtful whether those will take place. They then got to look at the rugby championship, which is difficult because it's played across 3 different continents, really. And so until we actually know when the travel ban is going to be lifted, then we've probably got 3 or 4 different scenarios that we are to when play is going to resume. So, but at the moment we've got a fund set up that will help countries that are in real need of cash.
And in terms of how you're managing that situation, Bill, have you got a crisis team set up to look at various scenarios, or how are you managing the process day to day?
Yeah, well, the process is sort of a group that looks at it with independence on it as well. Sort of not all people from working inside World Rugby. We've got independence there, looking at the different worst case, best case scenario. We are fortunate in one way that we're we're sat on some after the World Cup in Japan. If this had happened sort of 12 months previously, then the whole sort of global game would have been a real more of a challenge than it is at the moment.
Obviously, the financial difficulties of rugby as a sport are pretty well documented, both in terms of club level domestically, but also internationally, with unions such as Australia having financial difficulties, the US, the Pacific nations. How perilous is the current situation for the game, and what steps can the game take to try and press the reset button, if you like?
Well, I think the one thing that, if you can say there is an opportunity, and you can't say there is an opportunity when the people are losing their lives by the thousands, I think there is a greater collaboration now between the North and the South, and thinking, well, actually, can we make things better? I think whereby in the past there's always been probably an entrenched attitude from the North that very successful Six Nations championship that is played before full houses, and and it's been going for over 100 years. And you've got the South, which don't have the tradition of those kind of matches and those tournaments, and they're having to pay sort of European salaries to keep all their better players. And it's the same with, and then you've got the Pacific Islands as well, who have made such an enormous contribution to world rugby. If you think how many brilliant players they produce with the meager resources, you know, so much natural talent, and sort of how we can keep them going. It's a balancing exercise, really.
And Josh, in terms of how it's affecting you as a players in the domestic league, obviously we don't know when the season's going to start again. Things like contracts, recruitment, fitness, well-being. How's it affecting you and your colleagues at Sale Sharks day to day?
Yeah, because I sit on the I'm our RPA rep as well, so I kind of represent our group of players for Sale, and yeah, so I think at Sale, you know, every club's different in terms of, you know, the amount of players out of contract. Sale, we only had a couple of players out of contracts and a couple of players retiring, so we probably weren't in a quite as difficult position as some of the other clubs. But yeah, there's just a lot of uncertainty regarding, you know, obviously the clubs are losing out on all this income, and you know they're desperate to kind of get the season back underway as soon as possible. But then you open up, you know, different issues such as player welfare, and you know it's not quite like football where, you know, rugby players need a bit longer in terms of preparing to go back into that, you know, that environment, you know, week on week at the elite level. So, you know, football is probably, I think they've said a couple of weeks, rugby is more likely 4 weeks. So it's kind of how do you fit that in? And then, you know, also players are asking the question, you know, where does that leave us for next year? Because it could be a case where, you know, if we do want to play in July, August and get back going, then, you know, players are going to be playing rugby for 12 months. And is that the best thing for us? So, yeah, there's so many different, you know, scenarios going on. Players at different circumstances, as you said, players out of contract. You know, if they've, you know, we've got a player coming in from Exeter, does his contract still stand? Does he join us at the end of June? It's a lot of unanswered questions, which I'm sure, you know, behind the scenes at the Premiership Rugby that are, you know, that they're working towards, and you know, obviously they've got to be in discussion with the other stakeholders in the game as well.
And Bill, what are your views in terms of the impact this is having at a level like that? You know, somebody like Sam Hill going from Exeter to Sale Sharks potentially might have to play for Chiefs after his contract's finished. Scheduling longer term, we've got a Lions tour next summer. What are your thoughts on how we can resolve the current situation once we are back up and running?
Well, I think that is going to be that's the big challenge, because we don't know when we're going to restart, either domestically or otherwise. And then within the domestic competitions, you've then got Europe. You've still got the Six Nations to complete. You've still got internationals to sort of play to finance the game. And it's sort of, if you look at the finances in world rugby, actually the bigger unions with the bigger overheads have got the largest costs. Now, if you don't have a big stadium, and if you don't employ a lot of people, then you can probably ride it out better than somebody like the RFU, for instance, who has such a big operation. and it relies on the income of Twickenham, and really Twickenham funds the game in England. It is for most countries, you know, that the international they fund the game domestically. So I think there's going to be a challenge, and it will be a challenge between domestic club rugby and international rugby once this is lifted. And until you know when it's actually going to be lifted, and then you don't know. And as you've alluded to, that sort of very, very busy season coming up, when you've got the end of it is the British in 12 months' time. You've got the British and Irish Lions going to go to South Africa. And also you've got other teams going to, I think, go to New Zealand. And so really, the sort of, it is till you know when it finishes. So we're in dialogue with all our unions, and they then deal with the leagues, and we're in dialogue with the International Players Association as well. They sit on Omar Hussain, who's the chairman of that, chief exec. He sits in on our meetings, so he keeps it abreast of what's happening from a player's point of view, because it's important that whatever decision we make, that we have to take players with us, we've got to take unions with us, who all want to get underway. Because a club is exactly the same as an international team. They need the income to pay the wages.
Absolutely, and I suppose at some point we get to the position where once seasons and rugby has started playing again, you've got the massive conflict between the financial imperatives of funding unions, funding clubs, but also player welfare.
Indeed, yeah, that's right. And so hopefully by getting all stakeholders involved, and at least that they're in the room, and that's what we're trying to do. We have more and more meetings that sort of, you know, that obviously the way that it works at the England thing, Bill Sweeney, the chief executive of the RFU, he's in constant dialogue with the club, for instance. You know, because you know the PRL, there's 12 clubs in that, and so 13 part of the investigation, and it's the same with the Pro 14, you know, and the LNR as well with the FFR.
And Josh, what are your thoughts on that once we're back up and running at a domestic level in this country? Has there been dialogue between the Players Association reps about making sure players are put at the forefront and their welfare safeguarded?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's always our kind of main discussion point as a players' union, just to to make sure that we're being looked after and not being left in a vulnerable position. You know, not just from this, but kind of throughout any of the seasons. But yeah, it's just you know, we got told by the clubs, we haven't actually spoken. I think we've got a meeting later this week, but it's been a bit quiet as kind of we're progressing to lockdown. But before speaking to the club, we were told kind of what they thought the best case scenario would be, what the worst case scenario. I think worst case would be that almost this season won't continue, and we just start again fresh next season, which would solve many of the player welfare issues. But then obviously the financial implications for clubs, are pretty worrying. So I'm sure we'll be in constant dialogue as we know more about when we can start playing again.
And a question for both of you, longer term, where do you think the game needs to get to in terms of developing a world calendar and a more cohesive strategy to fixtures? Because there's been talk of world leagues, other competitions, international championships based on rankings, promotion and relegation at international level. In an ideal world, where do you think we need to get to?
Well, from a world, we are probably closer to the north and south, closer realising that they have to work collaboratively rather than sort of individually. So I would personally, this is my personal view, I'd like to see a season where the windows, they run consecutive months, so that you go down south, whether it's September, October, and then they come north, whether it's October, November. And then I think then the season is then finished, the south, and then in the north you would then play domestic rugby all the way through to the Six Nations stage where it is, and then you run all the way through to the end of June, and that's when the domestic season finishes. And then you obviously players rest. Challenge with that is obviously going away on a tour in September, October, preparation time to do that. But I do think that is a way of which you'd have more of a global calendar, in that you can then have competition within those two windows, a bit like the Nations Cup. You can so you leave the Six Nations, that's the Six Nations, that's it. But you have a competition in that time where you can have promotion and relegation into it, so that you can actually bring teams into the south, like Fiji and Japan, if they want to play in that rugby championship. So they've got 6 teams in the north, and then you can then have a competition where the likes of Georgia can eventually end up playing against the All Blacks, playing against Australia in those sort of windows, if they're good enough.
And just to complicate it further, Bill, where would you put the Lions tours into that schedule?
Well, the Lions go at the same time. So the Lions will go in September. They will go August, September.
Okay.
And then
Josh?
But when you're going to come back, and you on that schedule, you then have to have a complete partnership with unions and the close about player welfare, player rest. Where do the players get the rest on that? Which is vitally important that the players are consulted. And so on all the discussions, then you get the buy-in.
And Josh, what are your thoughts from a player's perspective?
Yeah, no, that I think that all makes sense. I think it's slightly different if you're just a regular, Premiership player, then you don't see as much change that if you're an international player, because you guaranteed your mandatory kind of 5 weeks off as a regular Premiership player, and probably more weeks off within the season now. So I think as long as you get that rest period at the end of seasons, enough time to kind of switch off and then come back into it, then as long as you're not being kind of flogged as a player, then I don't see there's going to be too much of an issue from a Premiership point of view. But I think in terms of for the game to grow, I think aligning the calendar is very important kind of going forward in terms of growing it and reaching out to a new audience.
And in terms of what that will do for squad sizes and player welfare, and Bill, I know you've had some thoughts around replacements and the number that are allowed. How do you think it will affect the game in that level, in terms of how many players per squad, how many players actually on the bench, and how many players being able to be used?
Well, I think that the 2 questions within that one. I think the first question is that if you have less overlaps between the international and the domestic game, then I think there will be less emphasis on having a big squad, because you have a big squad games when you haven't got your international players in, even though that they're meaningful games. I've been doing that. So when let's say if you've got 4 games during the season, then you've got promotion relegation. So you've got to make sure you've got a big squad for when you lose all your international players. Now, if that does away with that, so you have no overlap, obviously you still need a big squad because players need rested and need rotating. So I can see there would be squad sizes would be small. And then my other point is that myself as a old player, look at it, not as old as Clive Woodward thinks I am, by the way, still an old player, that I look at the game and so the shape of the game rarely changes because there's so many substitutes. The front rows are changed regularly to 55 minutes, 60 minutes. So there's then more collapsed scrums because the props have a bit more than you get in the start of the game, because there's more scrums tend to be second half than there are in the first half. So I'd like to see that sort of the side that it's not a game all about size. It's a game about skill and space.
Excellent. Thanks, Bill. Looking at another facet, another trend that's come into the sport recently, CVC have taken a stake in the game domestically. It's rumored that they're looking at acquiring other rights. How do you think the role of private equity will impact the sport as it looks to develop? What's the balance between commerciality and development?
Well, I think if you've got somebody who wants to enter into true partnership, which I understand CVC do, at the moment you have CVC are involved with the Six Nations, involved with the PRL, I do know that the probably we've talked to CVC, and I've had several meetings with them, asking them what their vision is of the global game, and their vision of the game is the same. That was surprisingly. I think if it, for instance, I can see in World Rugby, if you were to look at something like a Nations Cup, for instance, might be another quicker route to get funding into the game that you can then spread globally. I think that would be quite important to do it that way. But I think they've got to commit, which I know into the long run. So as long as you go in with your eyes open, then I think there is probably a place for them.
Josh, at a domestic level, obviously they're involved in the Premiership now. What do you think their impact's going to be?
I know it might sound slightly controversial, but as a lot of players will just see, they won't really know the understanding of what CVC are doing and their input into the game. They'll probably just see this quite simply as a good thing, because clubs have been given, for example, last year they got given this cash influx, and it depends what the different clubs did with that money, but a lot of that was spent on the playing squad. So players will just think, that's a good thing, because our wages increase and it's happy that we've only got short careers, so make the most of it. But then if you look at it from a wider picture, it's it's important that that money gets spent wisely to make the game more sustainable for the future. It can't just all go on playing squads, because as we see, if something like what's happened recently, COVID-19, and then it's not very sustainable, and we might see that wage cap or clubs really struggling now, because they spent all the money on players. So I think it's honestly, I don't think a lot of players kind of fully understand what CVC are doing, but it's for them to come in and try and grow the game in conjunction with the with the unions and with World Rugby, it's only a good thing.
I think just coming back to the point that they're not in it for the benefit, they're in it to make money. They're a commercial entity. But there's one thing that they probably, if they have an involvement with a lot of stakeholders, then they're probably an entity that could pull a lot of the stakeholders together.
Yeah, I think it's a good point, Bill. The views of private equity firms is that they'll probably want their pound of flesh at some point. But if the objectives and the values are aligned, then it's mutually beneficial to grow the game in a cohesive and structured and mutually beneficial manner, surely.
Yeah, it is. It's a way in which you're getting quicker funding, that they can benefit all. That I don't think it would be, for instance, to cover the shortfall, for instance, caused by the coronavirus. But I think if it's part of a long-term strategy, then I think we should certainly entertain it. Have dialogue with them.
Okay, thanks. But in terms of the governance and leadership, Bill, you've mentioned that you'd be keen on implementing a review of the current structures. Have you any thoughts on what that might look like and what the future might look like? You look at other sports, for instance, International Rugby League have recently appointed independent directors and independent chair for the first time. Is that the way World Rugby could go?
Well, it's interesting that they followed us, isn't it? We've had independent directors for the last 4 years, and there is no reason why you can't have an independent chair of it. I think what I'd like to look at is sort of, at the moment, we have an executive committee made up of the chairman, the vice chairman, and 7 elected members with 2 independents. What I'd like to see is, my personal view, is that you've got a players representative on it, that you would have automatically, you've got a women's representative on it, automatically you've got a representative from Tier 2 and the region. So you sort of represent far more of the global game than you do currently, which is probably not. It probably looks after more the Tier 1s than it does everybody else. So that would be a view, but I'd form a group to look at it, and obviously you can't preempt what they will come up with.
Okay. And Bill, another topic that you're reported to be looking at if you're re-elected is the player qualification regulations. I'd like to ask you both your thoughts on that and whether it's right that players could play for two countries that they used to a few years ago. You think back to people like Frank Bunce, Brian Smith, for those of us old enough. Josh, what are your thoughts on that initially?
Well, it's it's an interesting topic really, because there's arguments on both sides whether actually these guys have, say you've got the Vunipolas, for example, who've grown up, come from Tongan background, Tongan parents, and they've played rugby for England, but whether they can go back and almost boost the profile of these of the tier 2 nations, that especially if they go back to Tonga, they can really boost them as a nation and improve standards, and you can see that from a good thing. So, but then you look at it on the other hand and say, well, you got guys who have fought hard to play for that nation, and then for guys who have played a lot of international rugby to come back in and just take the spaces, then that might not be seen as unfair. But I think really kind of improve the standard for those countries if you get these guys that can go back and keep playing international rugby, and you'll see more competitive fixtures, I think.
And Bill?
Yeah, well, I think it's something that I've looked at it from, thought about it for many, many years. It's been mooted over a long time. I think that there's a difference between moving back from, and I hate the terms, by the way, tier 1 and tier 2. You're only tier 1 country because you play in an elite competition, not necessarily because of your ranking. So it's something I'd also like to look at, that you end up with ranked teams as opposed to peers. But let's say that if, for instance, the Vunipolas or the Palatines, for instance, who think once they've finished, you've got a stand down period from, let's say, England or Wales, who say, right, or New Zealand, who say, look, they haven't played for us for the last 4 years. We're never going to pick them again. Now, can they go back and help out Tonga? You forget Tonga is a population of about 110,000 people. And when you think of the amount of brilliant rugby players there are, and the same with Samoa, I think what it would do, it would make their in sort of very, very competitive teams, to go back and play, but also play in World Cups.
Is there not a danger that it could encourage young players in those countries to go and try their luck with one of the bigger nations in an England or a New Zealand, and if that plan doesn't work out, then go back to a plan B, if you like? Would that not be a concern?
Well, I think it's when you've got the economics of the world, there are always going to be players who will think, Fijians, they obviously, a lot of Fijians stay on the island, or not many, or go to France. But you've got a lot of second generation Tongan Samoans in there who were born in New Zealand, for instance, or Australia, who play in their teams. So I think it's inevitable that you're always going to try, and if you're a Tongan brought up in Auckland or Wellington, Tongan origin, then it's inevitable you try to get in the All Blacks team. Then if you can't get in the All Blacks team, then you then think, well, I'll then play for Tonga. So I think their first choice always is they're born in New Zealand. I think. I need to speak to Leopter or Tommy Dig, but I think historically they would always look and say, well, if I play for New Zealand, if I don't, then I'll go back and play for the country of my father and my grandfather. But you're always players who move up for financial reasons to play in Europe also.
Yeah, and looking at the finances again, I'm sorry to dwell on the point, but obviously this season we've seen the issues that Saracens have had around the salary cap. I'd like both your views on the salary cap, whether it's a good thing, a bad thing. Does it reduce the competitiveness at a European level of the English clubs when you compare it to France? What are your thoughts?
I'll let Josh answer that one first.
No, I think the salary cap is important for the competitiveness across, you know, the domestic league, because, you know, you can get, you know, you'll probably see in the scenarios that we're in at the moment that, you know, you get a few clubs who maybe have wealthier owners who just run away with the league each year, and that's kind of, you know, through what we're kind of seeing with Saracens, with what's come out from them recently. But yeah, I think it's important that, you know, it's there to maintain competitiveness, and for us players, that's what we want. We want a competitive league. We want our domestic league to be the best in the world, and I think it's crucial for that. And, you know, in terms of Europe, it's, you know, I think there's a few different factors going on in terms of the teams that do consistently well each year. I think if you look at the Irish clubs, for example, the way their players get dealt with, in terms of that, you know, that a lot of them are centrally contracted, and they will play the big European games and not necessarily a lot of the Pro 14 games. I think that's why you get that imbalance there with those clubs doing very well each year, where for us Premiership players, we're playing tough competitive fixtures week in and week out, and you almost find a case where when it comes to Europe, it's usually 6 weeks into the season, you just come off the back of 6 tough Premiership games, and you're going into 2 tough European games, where a lot of the Irish clubs, for example, Scottish, Welsh, have that opportunity to rest players and go full-fledged into that competition. So I think that's where you might find some of the imbalance. And, you know, it's not particularly to do with the structure of the salary cap in our domestic league. And then obviously France is a much higher salary cap, so they can afford to have these bigger squads with more players. So, you know, it's always going to be tough for us to compete on that level. But I think why the Premiership has been so attractive over the years is, firstly, the standard of rugby that's on offer, and also the standard across the league in terms of the competition between clubs. And I think that is a good thing that's come off the salary cap.
And Bill, where do you sit on this?
Well, I think it's really important that you have a level playing field for the teams in the league. Otherwise, you're always going to end up with the same 3 or 4 teams, always at the top, and the same 3 or 4 teams are always at the bottom, whatever league it is. What's the most successful sport really on the NFL? You know, where they have a draft system, very strict salaries, you know, and so it's, you start off your season, it's a level playing field. And I just think that certainly it's good for the integrity of the league. It's good for the competitive nature of it. You never want to go to any sporting event where you basically know who's going to win the match. You know, the excitement of sport is a challenge. And also, I think that it does. It puts far more emphasis on the clubs to produce their own players, you know, to out of their academies and their sort of feeder clubs, you know, to really develop that, rather than just buying in players because you can't be better than anyone else.
Okay, brilliant. Looking at the longer term development of the game internationally, we've just come off the back of a brilliant World Cup in Japan. Obviously, the final wasn't that brilliant, but where do you think the opportunities lie in terms of the importance of the women's game developing the game globally, and other formats such as sevens, Rugby X that we've seen recently, esports formats? Where do you both view that?
Do you want me to go first, Josh?
Yeah, you could go first.
Yeah.
Global
Esports, I actually I think that I did the first voiceover for the Journal Alone, whatever game that was. How many years ago was that? The studio in Stockport, many 20 odd years ago. I think where's the development for I think the women's game is at a crossroads. That what we have been trying to do in World Rugby is to try and get women's tournaments, more games, you know, because, you know, what everybody wants are matches. And so what we're trying to do was setting up tournaments where hopefully in Europe, where where America will come over, Canada will come over, and they will play in a tournament of the promotion relegation to that. That's already part of World Rugby's plans. I think the starting off, growing the women's 7 series, for instance, vitally important, and trying to get a feed the 7 system into that, because 7s is probably a one sort of form of rugby where you can really accelerate the women's game. You know, so around schools, around universities, and things like that. I think that's really important. And building on the really successful Women's World Cup, by the way, people tend to forget, you're talking about Japan. It was fantastically successful in Ireland. Who would have thought that ITV would have put it on mainstream sort of TV on a Saturday evening? You know, when England lost, unfortunately, to New Zealand, and obviously next year we've got the Women's World Cup in New Zealand. So that's the first part of the women's game. I think the second part of where's the huge growth area? Africa. Africa is a huge growth area. Just look at what has happened to soccer, for instance, since they started the African Nations Cup. Think of how many great African players there are now playing around the globe and always going back and playing that competition. You know, it's a continent that is full of fantastic athletes. You know, raw material is unbelievable there. So I think that is one area that we really need to be looking at and concentrating. And then let's not ignore North America, Canada. What I do in North America is talking about the regulations whereby college rugby is really strong. But because of the world regulations, that because you're a student, it doesn't sort of count towards your qualification to play for the country. I think there's lots of students who would stay in the USA and play rugby there if they had a chance of playing for the USA Eagles. But as it is, that you'd have to 4 years at college there, and then you'd have to do another 5 years residency. So I think there's ways in which we can look at our regulations to help countries like the USA.
And Josh, what do you think of new developments in the game like Rugby X and esports and so on?
Yeah, you know, it was interesting tuning into that Rugby X back in, I think it was the autumn time. You know, obviously it's a new concept, and it's important to try these things out. From my point of view, I'm not sure. You know, I'd much prefer to watch sevens rather than Rugby X. I think it was interesting to see the standard of rugby and what it was like. But actually, it was quite a frenetic sort of game, and not the kind of thing I'd enjoy to play at that speed. And I think it was actually quite a physical contest, which I think kind of went away from what it was trying to achieve in a way. But it's good that kind of they're trying to reach out and to these new audiences and try things out. And you know, esports is, you know, very important kind of from a younger point of view. You know, just trying to engage the millennials and the younger population into rugby, and to show what a great product it is and how much you can gain out of the game. And I think, you know, going back to the women's side as well, from the local point of view, I think Sale have just been, you know, we've just formed the new women's rugby team, and they're going to compete in the English Women's Premier League next year. I think that's great for an organisation and great for kind of from a local point of view to really broaden the organisation and to reach out to new, as I say, keep saying audiences, and to try and develop, you know, young players from around the area and build on the success that the England women's side have had over the past few years. I think, you know, they came off they were online for another Grand Slam this year. So, you know, it's a huge area of growth that we can really buy into as a sport.
Okay, just last question for me, and on a personal level, you're both in leadership roles, albeit very different. How do you look to develop yourselves personally, keep learning, keep developing in those roles, and make sure that you're constantly improving?
I listen to Josh.
Good answer. No, no, I think for me personally, obviously, I'm you know, almost about to finish the CEOs and Sporting Organisations course at VSI run, and I found that you know, extremely valuable from a personal development point of view. As I kind of came the old school route into professional rugby, I thought it was important to go to university first, get my degree, and I had a fantastic 3 years at university, and actually then to have a couple of years out, and you know, I've been lucky to hold some leadership positions at Sale. Being captain at Sale at 24, from a leadership point of view, was some of the hardest learning I've ever had to endure, just because it was interesting, you know, when I've had leadership roles kind of at university, how easy it was compared to being in a professional sport when things aren't going well, and you learn a lot about your leadership style. And coming into this course and speaking to a lot of different leaders from different sports and organisations and learning from them is something that's I found really valuable. And you know, I'm always constantly trying to grow my knowledge, not just of rugby, but of other sports, and about my own personality as well. So that's something I'm always looking to do.
Bill,
on a serious note, all I do, I become a good listener, and I always sort of, I would go to a meeting and I listen to what people say, and I think sort of when you're chairman, you've got to be a good listener, so that you're there to chair the meeting. You might want to drive it but the chief executive should drive the business. The chairman should be the glue that keeps it all together. And my role, I look upon in whatever I've done, at the RFU or when I was at the Six Nations, you know, the executive staff drive the business. The chairman chairs it, working, and you define the policy of the direction of travel you want to go, and then you task the executive team to get you there.
And in terms of your role at World Rugby, Bill, do you collaborate with your colleagues at other global federations? Do you get in touch with the guys at FIFA or ICC and look at best practice?
We meet on various sort of seminars and things like that, and basically we've all got the same issues. You know, sort of one sport's not in isolation to another. You've got, for ICC, for instance, you've got a funding model which is totally different, because you've got it funded largely out of one where most of the funding comes from India, and then you've got other organisations who are totally reliant on the money that they would get from the IOC, for instance, or their government. So everybody has a different model. The World Rugby relies on one event. You know, we were lucky that it was a fantastic event in Japan, you know, and far better financially than we ever expected. What we have to do is ensure that we take the game and use the World Cup as a catalyst, for whether it's in North America, whether it's in South America, whether it's going back to Australia to help them out, or in Europe, you know, to other areas of Europe. That's important.
Gents, that's been fantastic. Thanks very much for your time. I'll quickly hand over to Tim, who I'm sure has got plenty of questions from the people tuning in.
Yeah, cheers, Tom. I think you've covered quite a chunk of ground there, and thank you, Bill and Josh, for the transparency and honesty of which you've answered them. Going back just a few sentences ago, Jane's asked, following on from your comment, governance should be representative of the game. What are the blockers? How can you personally unblock them? And what are you doing to sell it?
Well, whatever you sell in life, you got to take people with you. And actually, you sort of, people forget that whatever you do in life, you've got to be a salesman. I don't care what you do in life, you've got to be able to sell a product, or sell yourself, or sell your ideas, and take people with you. I suppose, looking at it, would blockers be people who don't want any change? What you find in sport, people don't like change because they're used to doing things the traditional way. And in life, by the way, Tim, it's a lot easier to say no than yeah, what a great idea. Let's get on with it. And so you've got to take people with you. And that's what I would say. And how it enhance the game, and maybe look at a bigger picture.
Okay, that's really good. That leads nicely actually into Ed's question, which was on reflection of such an important role that you've got. What are sort of how do you instinctively know that you're the right person for such an important job, especially when there are people around you that are undermining you? And I know it's probably a bit of a feel free to answer it or not in the best way you feel.
Is that Mr. Slater?
Sorry, say that again, Bill.
Mr. Slater.
No.
No. Look, I think, Ed, in life, necessarily not always a popularity contest. What you rely on is people challenge you, not necessarily agree with you all the time, but you actually have a conviction that you think you are going to make a difference. And I know other people might disagree with you and think there's other ways to doing it, but it's I look upon my all of the things I've done in life. I've been a people's person, try and take people with me. I'm also a pragmatist. I also realise what is acceptable, what's not. But the majority of my life that I've run businesses. I'm not a professional sporting chairman. I've had to run organised businesses, and I think that teaches you. Also, I've been a team player. I've always played team games, known as the captain. That is not necessarily a popularity contest, that you have to make decisions, and hopefully, if you're honest about them, then people will follow you and respect those decisions.
Great answer. I mean, it's done like a true politician, Bill. I've got to say, it was really good. So, and this next one's probably just as good for Josh to answer. And the Rugby World Cup in Japan was a brilliant experience. You know, the pandemic aside, do you think the Japanese union and other major unions are doing enough to build on the back of that tournament's success?
I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer over the Japanese union. I'm sure Dan's probably better than that, but just it was fantastic to see what a success the Japanese, you know, taking it to a new location, to a new audience, to see the success that the Japanese team had, and hopefully, as the question said, you know, hopefully they will build on this and, you know, learn from, you know, past examples, not just in rugby, but across sports where organisations, where unions haven't successfully done that. And I think it's a fantastic opportunity for the Japanese union on the back of, you know, firstly for them being so successful in the home World Cup, and obviously the amount of press and the amount of interest it got globally. So I'm not sure whether we conceded such results. Yeah, I'm sure, you know, maybe Dad has more information on that, but I'm sure, you know, it's a perfect opportunity for them, and you know, it's one that they might never have again.
Yeah, I just thought from a player's perspective, Josh, maybe, you know, like think about what's happening in Europe and the areas that your dad's already highlighted. As a player, do you think that some of these unions could be pulling together pretty much like your dad's trying to pull stuff together? If there was a more of a global alignment with this sort of stuff, that rugby would be elevated in its perception. Yeah,
absolutely. I think to you know, if there's, you know, I think that's what's being looked at now. You know, new opportunities for, you know, for different clubs to play each other, and you know, to create some excitement about the game, and for the unions to, if they can work together to kind of grow as one, and to, if they're all aligned on the same, you know, the same pathway, then that'll only be better for us players. If there's you know, more interest around the sport, you know, it creates more competition and you know, a better global game.
Okay, which is what we all want, really. We want it elevated. The next one's from Hein, actually. With rugby possibility moving to a global season and touching on European club rugby, should it be an option for World Rugby to set standard on salary caps worldwide to make sure that we have more competitive balance across competitions played across different countries? And that's wide open for both of you. I mean, you know, to get a player's perspective on that, and a politics. And a nice domestic politician round on that would be great as well. So, you know, feel free. Who's going first?
Well, I'll take Dad's prerogative here. I think going back to the very interesting earlier question, the appointment of the World Cup, the awarding of the World Cup in Japan was made 10 years before they actually hosted it. And in that time, investment in Japanese rugby, so that when the actual World Cup hit their shores, they were able to take advantage of it. So I think there's long-term planning, and also now the skill is in the post-World Cup in ensuring that the game continues to grow in Japan. Not without challenges domestically, because you've got an extremely strong league there, which is largely run by commercial organisations. You know, Kirby Steel, people like that. They're run by the big multinational businesses. What we have to do is sort of build it up more in the university and school, things like that. So there's a lot of long-term planning. Coming back to the original conversation about the Nations Cup, was actually about global salaries. How can we control costs in the business? That's the important thing, because what happens is that since the game has gone professional in 1995, then basically wages have followed income. No profit in there.
Yeah.
As there been an escalation in the income, then there's been an escalation in the outgoings, and that has been, everybody's always chasing to get more money, pay everybody more, pay better salary. Let's be realistic. That certainly, I know you're all. If you look in normal people's day jobs, salaries that are paid in sport are significantly higher than what you get working anywhere else. Just as a reality check, when they do get up and running, people start employing, just employment pages of any of the major national papers and how many jobs that they're offering, and they are significantly less salaries than we get in.
No, I get that. That's again, it's transparent, it's honest, and sincere. I don't think you can ask for a better clarity on that particular subject. I think there's probably just about time to wrap up. In the context of time, really appreciate the insightful knowledge that you've brought to the table there, and the depth with the directness of which you've answered those questions as well. You know, that with true honesty, that's done with true integrity. I appreciate that a hell of a lot. Tom, I'm going to pass this back to you just to kind of wrap up, and then if you can do a hospital pass to Tony, who will tell us who's coming on next week, that would be awesome. But thank you very much, guys. Really good to meet you, Bill and Josh. Good luck with the recovery. Back to you, Mr. Sears.
Thanks, Tim. And yeah, final word. Josh, Bill, thanks very much. Appreciate you taking time out. Obviously, massively busy at the moment with your respective roles that you're playing. Just one final question that springs to mind. You know, if you had the magic wand, what's the one thing you'd change about the game that you'd snap your fingers and it'd be different?
I'll let Josh go first.
Give you time to think.
Yeah, that's you sold it. Yeah.
How to drop you.
Yeah, I think moving forward, I think as long as, I think from a personal point of view, from a play, something I feel very strongly about is that, you know, the players, and I know it's been a part of what my dad's been working hard on for the last 4 years, but, you know, the players' welfare is a huge priority. I'm a guy who's been injured a lot, and I think important that, you know, a lot of good work's been done, but kind of, especially in this tricky period that we're facing at the moment, that, you know, that we're still at the forefront of any decisions, and we're still a major player in the game, and that we get the adequate rest, and that, you know, we can continue to play the game we love for as long as possible. And we're, you know, whether that be law changes or season structure, then I think as long as, you know, the whole global season is aligned and you know, we're a major player in that, and then that's what I'd look at.
I would say to make certain that the game is player centric. At the end of the day, we rely on our players, and that I would think anything we can do to protect the players within the laws of the game, always ensuring that it is a game, physical contest. You know, that is the attraction of the game. But I think we have to look at it and think, well, what we have, anything we do, there is an element of risk. Whatever we do, there's an element of risk. What we have to do is make certain that we're not reckless, and so that any law changes that we make, and I would encourage all countries on leagues as well within those countries to embrace change and trial them, because unless you trial them, don't know what the unexpected consequences are of those law changes. So I think be open-minded about change, and that'd be my final.
Excellent. Gents, thanks once again. Really enjoyed talking to you, and I'll hand you back to Tony with details about the next session.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Bill, Josh, thanks very much for your time from VSI. We really appreciate it. Bill, best wishes with your re-election, and Josh, with your continued rehabilitation. I'm sure we'll catch up soon anyway, and maybe we'll get Sir Hale, who's on the CEO program, to invite us across to Blackburn for a game when they're up and running. With regards next week, we've got Dr. Thank you, Bill. With regards next week, we've got Dr. Ian Lawrence. We've got a double header. So next week, Ian will be talking about leadership resilience. And then the following week, he's going to be talking about toxic leadership, where he's actually using Jose Mourinho as the example, bringing his extensive research together in that particular area. So as normal, you'll find all the details on social media. And for the guys on the platform, you'll be receiving the invites from Emma. So until next week, guys, stay safe. See you all again. Thanks.